Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this seminar for the Center for African and African American Studies at Rice University. My name is Amy Dunham, and I'm an associate professor in the Biosciences Department here at Rice. It's my great honor to welcome the renowned scholar, Dr. Leonard Nwachukwu, to Rice and to introduce the seminar today. He's a professor of politics and international affairs at Princeton University, as well as faculty in the Department of Economics. He is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the founder of the African School of Economics in Benin, which is an up-and-coming world-class institution. Dr. Nwachukwu is also the founder and president of the Pan-African Scientific Research Council that engages over 500 scholars and fellows internationally, including across 32 African nations. Africa has tremendous research potential and talent, but it's unfortunately been scattered and underpromoted and poorly funded. So the idea of the council is to mobilize and engage with the many world-class African researchers and rising young scholars to address some of the current crises in health, environment, and social crises that are operating at global and regional scales. And in his own research, Dr. Nwachukwu has made groundbreaking contributions to the fields of political economy, economic history, and development economics. And I've been told that his work is required reading for graduate students in these fields at Rice. He has developed a novel approach to study the effect of education on social mobility using historical microdata from the first regional schools in the late 19th and early 20th century Benin. He uses data to look at links to intergenerational social mobility driven by parental aspirations. And this is what he's going to talk to us about today. I would like to alert everyone here to the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. If you have a question, feel free to submit your question there. And then Hassan Henderson-Lott, who's a grad student in religious studies, will moderate those questions at the end of the talk. Also, videos of this event and of previous events from the Center for African and African American Studies can be found on the website, which will appear in the chat or in the chat in a minute. And it's an honor, Leonard, to have you here with us today. And with that, I would like to invite you to share your work with us.
Fantastic, fantastic. Okay, so thanks, Amy, for the invitation. I wish this were in person, but so I'm at least happy with the opportunity to talk about the work that I have been doing. Let me start by maybe talking very briefly about the Pan-African Science Research Council that I set up, because I hope this will interest many of the colleagues from Rice University. So as Amy has said, it's an association of Africa-focused scientists and professionals, and we have roughly 4 subfields: social science, biomedical science, energy, environmental, agricultural science, applied math, and computer science. So the core objectives are to highlight and reward excellence in research, and then promote career development, encourage interdisciplinary collaboration, generate pipeline of African researchers through public engagement, encourage evidence-based policymaking, and enhance decision-making in the private sector as well. So we have an executive committee, we have a policy engagement committee, research committee, career development committee. We have a journal, we have an editorial board, and a management team. So as Amy has said, we have roughly 520 members from a wide range of countries in Africa and also Europe and the US. Okay. So, today I'll be sharing with you my work on colonial schools and the spillover, the education spillovers generated by colonial schools dating back to late 19th century until recently. So before, let me acknowledge that this project is part of a bigger research portfolio by the African School of Economics, which involve sustained field operation in Benin and Nigeria, 12 years running. And So African School of Economics, as Amy have said, it's a hopefully a world-class institution. We are getting there. We have master's program, bachelor program. We are running a joint degree program in South Africa and in New York. And we have done quite well in PhD placement. Actually, we have 2 students currently teaching, studying at University of Houston. Okay, so let me talk about the project and the paper itself. So let me start with motivation. The project is about knowledge diffusion, which is essential for growth and development. The channel of the channel through which human capital and education affect growth is through technology adoption, labor market effects, meaning when there's growth, there are jobs, opportunity for the educated and also for the non-educated. It improves institutional quality and occupation diversity, like structural transformation of the economy happens through education. There have been recent research on a lot of work have been done recently on the long-term persistence of education. So investment from the past still persist in its effect over centuries, either through social networks, aspiration, or culture. So the project that I'll be presenting to you it aims at providing an integrative approach for the study of those spillovers, education spillovers, and the mechanism for their persistence using micro-evidence from colonial schools. So I'm going to exploit the fact that I'm going to use the fact, the historical context of the creation of those schools, because it happened, to some extent, randomly, in a haphazard way. That will help me make claim about the causality of the effect of education on the outcome, like education, growth and income. I'm going to also to exploit the timing and location of the colonial institutions by, first of all, focusing on locations where the school were created, but also individuals who were selected to go to the school. So the bigger question then is how education affects income over 3 generations, and what are the mechanisms? Is that labor markets, income, aspiration? Is that the redistribution norm within families? Is that also, does it happen through change in attitude? Okay, so let me preview the results. I find from the study that the educated, in the first generation, the generation that actually that were around when the school was created, they have better living standard, they are less likely to be farmers, and they have wider social ties. And I also find, looking at the second generation, the children of the people who went to the school, or people of the same generation as those who went to school, who were first generation to have gone to school, I find that the second generation, the descendants of people who did not go to school in the first generation, their children close the gap with the children of those who went to school. And this happened within families and also in the village, meaning in those educated heavily influence decisions of those who were not educated, even within their family or in the village or in the neighborhoods where the school was created. And now coming to the third generation, I find that in fact, those who, the grandchildren, the descendants, the grandchildren of those who did not go to school but living near someone who has been to school outperform the grandchildren of those who has been to school. So the surprising result from this exercise is that being close to someone who has been to school, but not being educated yourself, makes your grandchildren perform better than the children of those who has been to school. I'm going to be more explicit about this in a second. So I also find that the mobility of the third generation was sustained by positive life outlook, work ethics, and self-reliance. Okay, so the contribution of the project is at 3 levels at least. One is the literature on social mobility, which is developing very rapidly, but use big data, and rarely the exercise rarely performed outside the US and Europe. I'm doing this in Benin, and I'm using a very different strategy, not big data, but I'm using different empirical strategy I'm going to be presenting in a second. So, and also what this does is not only to document mobility, intergenerational mobility, but to focus on the externalities. The way in which the mobility of one affects, or the mobility within one family, will affect the mobility of neighboring families or family members. So anyway, so let me talk about the context in a second. So how those schools were created. I'm just to give the example of one school, the one that is less than 2 kilometers from my hometown. The school was created by 2 priests, one from Indiana called Pierre Schenkel, the other one from France. And the creation of the school was nearly random. The decision to create the school happened, in a more or less random way. So first, they were traveling inland to explore the source of the main river from Benin called Ueme. And when they were coming back, they almost died and was helped by local villagers. So they were instructed by Vatican as a Thanksgiving gesture to set up a school in the location where they nearly died. And they selected a bunch of kids, more in a more or less random way to create the first class. And so you can see that there was no systematic plan to set up the school in Zayanado, in that location. And that makes the exercise of looking at the effect of education on various outcomes, looking at the causal effect, looking at it, it's actually easier. So what I did next was actually to select a number of locations where school had been the first, that had the first school in the region and had been set up more or less the same way. And those schools has to be at least 100 kilometers from the coast, because this area was, has European settlements, and you can assume that places with European settlements with better institutions, those places, for instance, may have been exposed to the value of education. So as a result, the choice to send children to school was informed. But outside, more inland from 100 kilometers up, you can assume that, the households and the families were not aware about the value of European institutions. So as a result, the decision to send the kids to school were not informed. It was no self-selection. So, so I selected 4 locations. Zayanado, where the school was set up in 1895, Kandi 1913, Sabe 1911, and Nachitengu 1922. So, okay, now, I need to be able to compare outcome in near the school to outcome far away from the school. I did the following. So I have I put 7 kilometer radius around the school, assuming that when you are within 7 kilometers, you have the opportunity to go to school. But when you are outside, like from 7 to 20 kilometers, you have less opportunity to go to school. So I consider villages or individuals living within 7 kilometers to be treated, to be exposed to education, and those from 7 to 20 to be in the control, Okay, now I list all the villages in those areas and selected 2 of them, So this table shows you that we have the villages that went to, where schools were created are similar in along many dimensions with villages that are in the control, in several dimensions, sort of mean elevation, soil quality, average rainfall, distance to port, and so on. So, okay. So then the counterfactual of the location counterfactual of where the school has been set up is such that outcomes or the different characteristics are very, very similar. Okay. So now, having selected the locations, and not only the location where the school were created, but the location that looked like this where the school had been created, but with no school, I now need to sort of look at how the students, I need to select the students, the different cohorts. So what I did was, first, I find the list of the first 2 cohorts of students from the 4 schools using archival information and using informants like descendants of those individuals. And then for individuals who did not go to school but living near the school, I did what I call backward sampling, which is I went to the village, select number of individuals, ask about their grandfather. So this way, I have a sample of individuals who have been to school, a sample of individuals living near the school but did not go to school. I did the same thing for the control, meaning location too far from the school, and no one from there has been to school. So again, I went there, interview individuals, and then ask them about their grandfather. So now I have a full sample of the first 2 cohorts of individuals who have been to those colonial schools, a sample individual living near the school but did not go to school, what I call treatment 2, and then individuals who did not go to school, live far away from school. The difference between T2 and control is that these people from T2, they did not go to school, but they were exposed to some people from T1 who had been to school. Okay, so this is from a picture of the first 2 cohorts of the school in Zainado. And this is an archival material that I used to find the names of those kids. And now, the reason why I'm extremely fascinated by the story is because it's personal. So this is my uncle, Rene, who was among the very first to have been selected to school. Those are my parents, my mother and my dad. And this is me, second generation. This is me in 6th grade, now in middle school, and more recently at the induction at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. You can see the evolution. Okay, but growing up, I was presented as the reincarnation of my uncle. So I was living to basically really get my community, get my parents to fulfill, the ambition that my uncle instilled in the whole family. So this is a picture on one individual who, in fact, went to one of the school of Natintengu that was set up in 1922, and who was still alive, when the project was being conducted. So he gave us a lot of detailed information about his classmates, about those in the village who did not go to school, and so on. So not only in some instances we use, we interview descendants to have information about the first generation. We use archival information, but sometimes we have, at least one instance, we have one individual who actually did go to the school. And this is, for instance, a picture of me interviewing an informant who used to be the mayor of the town where I grew up. Okay, so now let me go to the second generation. Second generation. So we have the first generation, as I described to you. Second generation. I list all the children of individuals from each group, T1, T2 control. I list all the siblings, okay? I sample children of each subject, because, some people have more than 10 children. So if you have more than 7 children, for instance, we will, if you have less than 7, we select all the children. If you have more than 7, we have to sample, okay? So we sample children, we sample sibling, and now we list children of a sample sibling to have nephew and nieces. This is a way to look at intra-family spillovers. We also sample nephew and nieces, and then we do social demographic survey of sample children, nephew and nieces. So we have a first generation, and then the second generation, we use this methodology to select individuals to be interviewed. Okay, so as you can see very briefly here, so those who went to school are less likely to be farmers. Those who did not go to school are far more likely, nearly 80%, but less than those who live outside the area where the school was created. So it just shows you that even in the first generation, education has an impact, particularly an impact among those who did not go to school but were living near the school, and they have better outcome, all along. Okay, so this shows that they have better living standards, they have, and so on. Okay, so this is a picture of somebody from the first generation. This is a picture of somebody from the control family, and the picture tells you the big difference in the living standard, among the first generation. You have then a lot of inequality, that education brought within the first generation. Okay, so we have better social ties. Okay, now let's look at the second generation. Second generation, you can see, for instance, that here, the children of those who have been to school have 70% chances to be educated. But those living in the village who have not been to school, they are 52% of chances to be to school. You can see from this that the gap in education level has shrunk considerably from the first to the second generation. Those living far away from the school, the number is lower, which means that even though this has, the gap between the T1 and T2 has shrunk, the gap between T2, T1 and control has remained very wide. Okay, so living standard, and in terms of probability of being, of moving out of farming, same thing. Okay, so this, confirm economically, what I just said earlier, which is first, inequality, first generation, inequality has shrunk, second generation, between T1 and T2, but has remained wide between T1, T2, one hand, control on the other. Okay, so, and this econometric exercise confirms what I just said. Okay, this is, for instance, the second generation of a treated family. Okay, so we have what are social ties, and among social ties is not only, language, but also, for instance, having, white friends, because the whites, white colonists or white people from the colonial administration, ties to those individuals give you a higher status. So you can see that in the second generation, the gap in terms of social networks between those descendant of the educated or and the descendant of the uneducated, or where complete where the gap has completely, the gap has narrowed considerably. Okay, not only in terms of income, but also in terms of social networks. Okay, now let me talk briefly about family externalities. So what we find here is that if you look at the second generation, the probability that your child is educated, when you are educated, the probability of your child is educated is similar to the probability that your nephew or nieces is educated. So in fact, there is some differences for primary education, but for secondary university level, it's more or less the same thing. It just shows that there was, strong transfer or aspiration type spillovers that led to education of one individual in the family to expand to education almost of everyone in the family. So there is something interesting that I find that I would like to share with you as well, is the effect of entrepreneurship. In our sample, some individuals, for instance, has some individual have they have shops. They are entrepreneur. So I want to see what happened to those individuals, because when you are educated, what can you do to your family? First of all, your very presence can inspire the children to do well. You can redistribute in terms of helping pay school fees, or you can also set up business to help your family member. So I find that sibling of educated individuals who own a shop, they are 20% less likely to be farmers, and their descendants are more educated. So it shows that when the family externalities, it happens not only through income transfer, but happen through setting up a family business, it makes the sibling better off and their children more educated. Okay, so there is something unique or something extra about transfer taking the form of entrepreneurship. Okay, so now this table shows what I have been saying earlier, which is there is very strong education mobility, strong income mobility from the first to the second generation, from the first to the second generation. Now, let me just talk about the third generation. So basically, as I said earlier, I have a group of individuals that I selected from this first generation, in different ways that I described, archives, interviews, and so on. I was able to get a list of individuals from the second generation. I use the same methodology to have a sample of grandchildren. So this helped me, try to find out about how what is the mobility, what is the rate of mobility from the second to the third generation. So sorry, if you look at this figure, you can see that overall, when your parents are lower income category, the third generation has 30% of chances of remain lower income category, but 60% of chances of doing better than their parents, while it's much lower for control. So it shows that education really improve mobility, not only from the first to the second, but also from the second to the third. Okay, so now this table is really interesting. So I separate out descendants of those whose grandparents were educated, descendants of those whose parents were uneducated or living in a village with school, and descendant of the control. As you can see here, when your parents were educated, so wait, when your grandparents were educated and your parent is low income, you are 28% of chance remaining low income. When your parents were, your grandparents were uneducated and your parents are low income, it's only 11% of chances. So in fact, if you look at the third generation, those who are doing better in terms of income mobility are those whose grandparents were not educated, but living near someone who was educated or living near a school. You see what I mean? So as you can see, the number is much higher for them here. Even for middle income, it's 7% here, 11% there, and 31% here, 22, 60% and 66. But still, when you add up, clearly there is what I call very large indirect effect of grandparents' education for low, particularly for low income categories. Okay, so so it just shows the strength and the power of externalities. You know, so first of all, you know, there is something about the first generation who did not go to school that use those who went to school as an inspiration for their children. That helped lower the gap. And then this initial aspiration, shock, I should say, persist and even develop, expand in the second generation. You know, okay. Next, I'm going to tell you that maybe this is not just a story of aspiration; is also there is also a story of change in attitude. So, but before I get there, let me show you some very interesting results, which is that education, in fact, has helped decrease income inequality in the communities where the school was created. So if you take, for instance, the first generation, you know, there is a big level of inequality in the treated villages compared to the control villages, you know, bigger here. In the second generation, the level of inequality has shrunk a little bit, this compared to that. But then when you take the third generation, it reversed completely. The villages where there was school has lower level of inequality than villages where there was no school. So this indicates that education really, colonial education, helped reduce income inequalities in the community where it was set up compared to control. You know, it's called the Great Gachi Curve, which is something that the late Alan Kruger, you know, from Princeton University, has discovered. So it's great to see that this relationship between education and inequality, mobility and inequality, is something that also works in the context of Africa. Okay, now to finish, I'm going to talk about the fact that, you know, the big jump from the second to the third for those whose grandparents were village treated may also be due to attitude change. And to do that, I look at how social mobility affect mental health, work ethics, self-reliance, and life outlook. And as you can see, mobility, you know, improve mental health, mobility improve work ethics, improve self-reliance, and life outlook. You know, so when, okay, let me put it this way. Attitude can be shaped by income level, where you are. It can be shaped as well by how far you came from. You know, the more mobility happen from the first to the second, the more likely you are to have, from the first to the second generation, I mean, the more likely you are to have a better life outlook, to be more self-reliant and have better work ethics. So that's what I was saying earlier, that maybe the mobility from the first to the second was sustained by aspirations, but maintained the third generation by positive attitudes that help boost mobility. Okay, so I use I show the result. It's robust when you use instrumental variable techniques. Okay, so before I conclude and get questions, so as I mentioned to you earlier, this is in fact this is part of a big research agenda that I started 12 years ago. So this exercise that I just presented to you in Benin, we are doing something nearly identical in Nigeria. We are also selecting the first colonial schools, looking at the first generation and sampling second generation and later the third generation, and document mobility across generation in Nigeria. But what is interesting about the Nigerian exercise is the fact that early on in the first generation, there were girls. In the Benin sample, only the school were open, the colonial school were open only to boys. In Nigeria, it was open to both boys and girls, as you can see from this picture. And we also heterogeneity in religion. There are schools set up in the south, particularly southeast, schools set up in the north, and heterogeneity in religion, competition with Islamic school, Quranic school, for instance, might weaken the effect or make the effect a bit different from one location to another. So Nigeria is interesting. Another important singularity of Nigeria is the fact that sometimes when a school is created in one location, like a Catholic school, for instance, there is a Protestant school that was set up like 5 kilometers away. So you have competition between missionaries that might in fact boost school enrollment and make mobility much higher. Anyway, so that's interesting. So in Nigeria as well, I think it will be interesting to have we have the opportunity to document social networks more closely, because some communities were hierarchical in the north. As a result, if community is hierarchical, so maybe the extent of the externality, the extent to which education spreads might be less, because if education happened, for instance, to someone with at the top, it only happened to few people, in this case, 2. Okay? But if, for instance, this is a more egalitarian communities, let's say in southeast Nigeria, where you have, education happen to somebody with more ties, it will happen to far more people. In this case, 2, here 6. And the data we are collecting include networks, so it will give us to see exactly how social network expand, the structure of social network expand education opportunities. So now another important exercise that I'm working on is the mobility not generated by just colonial schools, but generated by descendants, of slaves, former slaves coming from Brazil or the Caribbeans. So I was able to get my hands on some important archival materials on the passports of former slaves from Brazil who moved back to Nigeria and to southern Benin. And then after school was set up. So we can see how the combination of having former slaves returning to Africa, coming with their prior knowledge acquired outside Africa, and the institution that they brought from outside Africa, these combined with education opportunities, how they shape social mobility. That's another important information. Important exercise that we are in position of conducting. So we already digitized all the passports. So we are in the process of collecting the data. So we are extremely excited but to look at this unknown, this little known aspect of African colonial history. Okay. The third project, which is equally exciting, is the intergenerational social impact of the Dahomey Amazons. As you might know, from early 18th century to 19th century, the elite unit in the army of the Kingdom of Dahomey, the current Benin, was all female. And this is a picture of the last cohorts in 1905, at a reunion. So what I'm doing is I'm actually finding the names of many of these women, try to find out where they lived until they died, their children, their family members, their neighbors, their communities. And then I'm not only documenting the life they live to give a human face to those extraordinary individuals and help to tell the story of the Kingdom of Dahomey, the social history, military history of the Kingdom of Dahomey, but more importantly, to look at their legacy, to be able to capture, to that extent, the presence of those extraordinary women affect attitudes towards women and education outcome, social outcome for women, and so on. So the good news about this project is that it got recently a lot of publicity, because the Washington Post have written a story about it. And so as a result of this story, I got contacted by Hollywood, making a movie exactly about those women. And the movie is called The Woman King. And I'm happy to report that I had been recruited as a historical consultant, as a historical consultant on that movie. So this shows that, in fact, this kind of project can have, a much bigger impact, not only, outside academic circle. Yeah. Okay. So to summarize, basically what we did is very ambitious project, which consists of find the first school ever set up in Benin, and then find the first two cohorts, and then look at what happened to their neighbors, what happened to their children and nephews, what happened to their grandchildren. And the big story here is the size of the externalities. What happened to those they inspire? What's happened to those they influence was actually bigger than that happened to their own descendants. So the persistence of education across generation, shaped by the externalities, by the spillovers that I just described, is what I think is really extraordinary. And I think this should shape the way we design education policy in Africa today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. As questions continue to populate the Q&A chat function with responses to and engagements with Dr. Wachikun's lecture, I want to personally extend a word of thanks and appreciation to you, Dr. Wachikun, for so generously sharing with us this afternoon. No doubt, we've all garnered a great deal of insight and perspective on the goings on of the Pan-African Scientific Research Council, as well as the African School of Economics. To begin our Q&A, and I do see questions populating the chat function even now, so continue to bring those questions in. But to begin our Q&A, Dr. Wickerton, the research does well to sort of explain the social effects of a colonial education on the conditions of life within generally closed family groups, mothers, fathers, nephews, so on. As these closed family groups continue to attain more colonial education, greater access to economic participation, and thus greater social mobility, I'm curious to hear a little bit more about what the research suggests on the conditions of life among those still without education, as conditions of living gain greater access to sort of Western European colonial standards of life. And as you suggest, farming populations decrease. Have researchers been able to determine the sort of broader, more residual effects that access to colonial education has had on industries of farming and agricultural food sourcing within wider regions?
So let me say a couple of things. So what this exercise suggests is that access to education make you better off and make you more productive, and it makes the community have more occupation diversity, better institutions, and so on. Okay, so this is all compared to places without schooling. All right, so despite all we can say about colonial education, about the oppressive nature of colonialism, we have to recognize that there was human capital investment that took place, that some African communities embrace, that makes help them build better life for themselves. Unfortunately, these educational opportunities were limited in geographically, and places that were far away from those schools, they remain behind from generation to generation. So what we need to do is to get those communities to catch up by creating new schools, by creating more opportunities, because we know what schooling does to a community. We know what it does. So it's an invitation to expand opportunity, particularly with primary education, all over the places, and to take into consideration the fact that once in Africa, one person is educated, many people are educated immediately, not only within the family, but also in the neighborhoods. People who are not very distant, living in a very close vicinity of those individuals who have been to school. Okay, so but beside everything, what I really wanted to take out of this exercise is to show that the power of education, even colonial education, is its ability to spread quickly. And it spread different ways. It spread because of aspiration. When your neighbor makes it, you want to make it as well. It spread also because of development. When a school is created and there is the educated and the market expand, job opportunities are present, and even those who are less educated can take those opportunities. And also, once education improves lives, the fact that lives are being improved give people hope. They are more positive about the future, and this makes them even more likely to be successful. So if we want to take this to the US context, for instance, we can say that one of the issues with US education system is segregation. is the lack of access, lack of, like the fact that, like Trenton, which is only 15 minutes away from Princeton, there is very little interaction or connection between the inhabitants of Trenton and Princeton, between the children of Princeton and Trenton. So this makes, the spread of education like more limited. And this is part of the reason why, progress, economic, social progress is also limited. You see what I mean? So it's not just about investing, it's also allowing different groups, different communities to interact, and this interaction can push up aspiration. It can push up, can improve economic opportunities. And as a result, everyone is better off, So that's the main message that I would like to, I would like really to stress. Thanks for your question.
Thank you. There is an additional question, which reads, does the research suggest the impact of Western education on traditional cultural sensibilities in Benin? I have in mind languages, textiles and clothing design, food styles, music, among other culturally based pedagogies and forms of education.
So, okay. This question from the question, so the education, the curriculum in those schools were very European and did not integrate enough local culture, local history, and so on. Okay, so what we observe today will have been much higher if, particularly after independence, there were educational reform that integrate those values that the colleague just described. So what I'm showing here is actually the lower bound that of what education does. It could have been much better if, for instance, education was coupled with entrepreneurship, so that the only job that you have is not just work for government. You can use education to improve productivity, to create economic opportunities in your community as a whole. As I gave the example of educators who have shops, who did much better than those who did not. Okay, but also it could be much better if, for instance, you teach not only French but local languages. You teach not only European history but local history. That, for instance, the clothing, the food, from the community are part of what is taught at school. You see what I mean? So I'm not saying that the education provided was in any way perfect, but as you can see, even this European style imperfect, with all the limitation that we just described, it has this impact across generation. So things will have been much better if, for instance, we actually take into consideration the elements that the author the colleagues just described. So I think it's really important. The point I'm making here is education is highly valuable, and it has the power to spread not only spatially but also across generation, and even colonial education with all its limitations. So we should invest more in education. We should couple education with entrepreneurship. We should couple education with, teaching, developing our local culture, history, and values, to get the kids to be more self-confident, to be, anyway. So I'm not saying that the education received was anyway perfect, but despite that, it led to this effect that I just described.
One additional question before we close out. Says there have been some discussions here at Rice about starting an African Scholars Program to recruit graduate students for training here in various fields. Do you have any general recommendations, thoughts for us as we move forward in this direction?
I'm sorry, say it again. What's the question? I didn't hear well.
The question has to do with certain discussions that have been going on here at Rice about starting an African Scholars Program to recruit graduate students for training here in various fields of study. The question more pointedly says, do you have any general recommendations or thoughts for us as we move forward in this direction?
Yeah, I think it's, I'm extremely supportive of that. That's what I have been doing myself. I am one of the beneficiaries of this. I left Africa late 80s, and in a record time, I got my PhD, and now I'm investing back in Africa, not only the school that I set up, the council that I set up, and I have many of my students who, like for the past, 5 years, 25 of my students from my school are doing PhD in the US. One actually got a job at New York University last week. So yeah, I think it's a great initiative, and I think Houston, for University of Houston, the neighboring university, for instance, as I said, have a student from my school, and it will be great if this can be expanded to other programs like history, the sciences, and so on, and maybe. It may be possible to set up, like, for instance, collaborative initiatives back in Africa, so that for those who are not coming here, they can still benefit from the knowledge and education that Rice University could potentially provide. So I think it's a great initiative. But the colleague who asked the question can be in touch with me, and I can maybe suggest where I can make this. I can contribute to this effort by Rice University. Yeah.
Again, my thanks to you, Dr. Nwachukwu, for your time, spending your afternoon here with us at Rice University. It's been my pleasure to be in conversation with you. I'll pass it over to Dr. Amy Dunham to close us out.
Thank you for giving an excellent talk and taking the time to join us and talk about your work and all the amazing projects that you've been able to put together. So thank you very much.